Okay, so there's a lot of people wanting to build a gaming computer right now. For some people, it's going to be the first time you've ever tried doing that. For other people, it's going to be, you've done it before, but it's been a while. You're not really sure. There's so many different things that go into this. It can be hard to figure out where to get started. So what I want to present you guys with here is kind of a flow chart of how I think this through. And I do want to be clear, this is not the only right way to think this through. And please, in the comment section, I'd love to hear if you guys have a different sort of strategy or disagreements with this list, because that's fine. There's lots of right ways to do this. There's also lots of wrong ways, okay? So here's how I would recommend at least a framework for one way to think this process through. Number one is your monitor resolution and frame rate target. And I do want to mention this is for gaming PCs. If your purpose for building the PC is something other than gaming, this is probably not the best guide for you. All right, so for gaming PCs, you want to think through your monitor resolution and frame rate target. Basically, for monitors, you've got 4K, you've got 1440p, and then you've got 1080p. And then each of those comes with a variety of frame rate options. And you could also even go ultra-wide versions of those. And anyway, that's going to use, so ultra-wide 1080p or ultra-wide 1440p or ultra-wide 4K is different and will be more demanding on the GPU. And to be honest, it's going to be harder to target that because there's going to be less information available since that's still fairly uncommon. Now, personally, I went with a high refresh rate ultra-wide 1440p monitor, but you do you, and you'll want to research that. You might already own a monitor that you're not planning on upgrading, or you might be planning on using a TV that you have or something like that. So that can guide a lot of this discussion. Now, once you've made that choice, you'll start to look into GPU reviews. You'll want to look at, especially if there's certain games that you're particularly interested in or that you'll spend a lot of time playing, you can look at how the GPU runs that particular game at various settings and frame rates. And this is going to be the number one thing in a gaming computer. So that's the biggest deal, guys. It's the GPU. Your games won't run any better than your GPU will allow it, no matter how good the rest of your computer is. So everything else is secondary to the graphics card when it comes to gaming. Again, this is going to depend a lot on the monitor resolution, because if you're going to be doing a 1080p monitor, especially if it's only at 60 hertz, although these days you probably want to get at least 144 hertz if your budget allows, that kind of a thing. You don't need to buy the most expensive graphics card in the world to do that. Whereas if you're buying a 4K monitor and maybe even wanting to run at 4K above 60 frames per second, then you actually probably will need to buy the most expensive graphics card that you probably can. So that's going to be the big thing here. Now, you might have been originally thinking, I want to do 4K gaming. Then you look at GPU reviews, how they're running the games, and how much those things cost. Now you might suddenly be like, I don't have enough money. Let's revise that. Maybe drop down to 1440p, that kind of an idea here. Okay, so once you've settled in on a GPU and that will run your monitor resolution and hit the target frame rate that you're looking for and seems like it might fit your budget, now there's a lot of places you could go next. I'm just going to throw in the power supply. A lot of people forget about this, but this is a good time to just think about a power supply. You could adjust it again later, but you want to get one that's a good brand. That's actually a bigger deal than you might think, and then has a watt value that is greater than or equal to what the GPU recommends. It's nice to have headroom above the recommended value, because that would allow you to upgrade components in the future to things that draw more power than your original build. Because one of the nice things about a gaming PC is it's upgradable. And the power supply is one of the more annoying things to change out because of all the various cables that you'll need to unplug and things like that. So buying a good quality one with at least enough watts for your build, and if your budget allows, even more watts than your build needs, is going to put you in a good place as far as upgrading things in the future being as easy as possible. Again, you could decide on that later, but once you know your graphics card, you actually have a good idea of how many watts you're going to need. All right, from here, the next thing that really impacts performance is the CPU, the processor. And one of the big things that you're going to see here is that the more cores you get, the more expensive it gets, okay? And so you might be wondering, how many cores do you actually need? Well, again, if you're only targeting gaming, then fewer cores are needed comparatively to if you were, for example, also planning on doing a lot of video editing or streaming or other processor-intensive tasks. That would generally mean that you would want to get more cores. So that's the basic idea. We've got more cores are going to benefit you more if you're doing things other than gaming. If you're only gaming, at least right now, beginning of 2021, 6 cores is actually plenty. Some games, but very few of them, can take advantage of more than 6 cores. And you could go down as low as 4 cores if you're on an extreme budget. So that's kind of the general 2 cents I'd throw in there. Now you've got the choice of like Intel versus AMD and all of that. Look at your budget, look at what your price is going to allow you to get, look at gaming performance, and then also keep in mind that if you buy a really, really good processor, your gaming performance is still going to be limited by your GPU, most likely, especially if you didn't buy the most expensive GPU in the world. So if you're wondering where to spend more money, for gaming, the graphics card is more important than the CPU, although the CPU is a very, very close second, okay? Now, so some CPUs, by the way, are going to come with a stock cooler, and you could save some money in your build by just using that. Although getting a better cooler could allow for better performance and maybe even some overclocking, but there is diminishing returns here. You don't want to spend so much on your cooler that you could have just got a better CPU in the first place. And many CPUs won't come with a stock cooler, so you are going to have to budget for one for a lot of choices here. Now, once you've chosen your CPU, you're going to want to choose your motherboard, because the motherboard needs to be compatible with the CPU. So if you chose a Intel CPU, you can't get an AMD compatible motherboard. But even if you have an Intel CPU and an Intel motherboard, they don't necessarily have the same socket. So you're gonna wanna look at the CPU and see what socket type it needs. And you're gonna look at the motherboard and see what socket type it supports. It'll probably also just have a list of specific CPUs that it is compatible with. Now, the motherboard is a place where you could definitely overspend. And it can also be a confusing place. A lot of people aren't sure what the different chipsets are and what they offer, all of that. Well, one of the basic things is that the more expensive chipsets generally have things like more USB ports or more PCIe, speed or slots or all sorts of different things. But for a lot of people, especially if you're just going to be gaming and just doing basic gaming, you don't need some of the stuff the more expensive chipsets offer. And then beyond that, a lot of what they're offering is better cooling and power, not necessarily cooling, but it might have better like heat spreaders and better power delivery systems for serious overclocking. To be honest, if you're on a serious budget, you could probably get the cheapest motherboard that's compatible with your CPU, bearing in mind that you look up reviews to make sure that that motherboard doesn't have a lot of reports of it actually just not functioning. But if you get a functional motherboard that's compatible with your CPU, that's a good place to start. And then you can increase your motherboard as your budget allows, but realizing that you're probably not gonna get a lot more straight up gaming performance from spending a lot more on the motherboard. Again, I'm oversimplifying, but that's my general opinion on all that. Okay, so where to go from here? So you've got your GPU, which is the number one most important thing. You've got your CPU. You picked a compatible motherboard. Again, double check that your power supply is going to provide enough power for both the GPU and the CPU. And then move along to RAM. Okay, so your RAM, first of all, a couple of things. It's not just the amount, you also want to make sure you're getting 2 sticks. So two sticks of 8 is better than 1 stick of 16. That's because it'll allow you to run in dual channel mode, which is faster, so don't make that common mistake. Next thing is the speed of the RAM, and Ryzen, at least right now, tends to prefer higher speeds. I mean, so does Intel, but it has a larger performance impact on Ryzen processors than it seems to on Intel processors, and we don't need to get into why that's the case, but so really up to like 3600 megahertz or so could make sense to try to target that for Ryzen's, whereas even just being more around like 3000 might be fine on Intel, and honestly even being around 3000 might be fine on Ryzen if that's what your budget allows. But I'm saying on Ryzen's, look for those higher speeds as long as you're not paying a lot more for it, because the performance difference is noticeable but not huge. So don't overspend on that. That's easy to do. And then also, as far as how much you need, over 16 gigabytes is going to be hugely diminishing returns in for gaming. Okay, a lot of games you'd honestly still be able to run at 8, although right now, building a PC right now, at the beginning of 2021, when I'm filming this video, I wouldn't personally build one with less than 16 unless you're on the absolute tightest budget. Okay. But that being said, I wouldn't also build one with over 16 unless your budget really does allow, because you can also slot in more RAM, especially if your motherboard supports 4 RAM slots instead of 2. Again, that's one of the things you might get from a more expensive motherboard, would be the ability to grab 2 sticks of 8 now and then slot in another compatible 2 sticks of 8 at a later date, to increase your upgradability. All right, next you can start thinking about your storage. Now, I would say get an SSD. Don't just get a hard drive, even to save the budget, unless for some reason you're just doing the most budget build absolutely possible. SSDs aren't that crazy expensive right now. Get one. It's going to be a night and day difference in terms of the speed of your computer. However, some of them are kind of garbage compared to others, so I would definitely look up reviews for these things. For example, don't get a SSD that doesn't have a DRAM cache unless it's like an NVMe, blah, blah. Just look up reviews of the model you're getting. Now, increase the size and speed as your budget allows, but definitely at least get an SSD. And then you can throw a hard drive in for extra storage if your SSD was kind of small. And you can also just buy more SSDs in the future as your budget allows over time. So that would be kind of my recommendation there. Now you can start thinking about your case. So the biggest thing about the case in terms of compatibility is your case does need to fit the CPU cooler that you chose. Some of them are really tall and won't fit in a really small case. Also, some GPUs are really big, and so your case should actually give you maximum sizes for the cooler and a GPU that they will support. Then you can also look up airflow reviews for that particular case. And you should also, consider the looks. Like, the case is going to be the biggest thing that people will actually see if they're physically looking at your computer. And then, if it has a big acrylic window, now you might start thinking about things like RGB on the components inside, because now they're visible. But you could just buy a case that people can't see in and have a decent looking case and not worry about all the RGB and what it looks like inside your case. All right, and again, this is a place that you could definitely overspend. Some cases get really expensive, but don't really improve the performance other than slight airflow differences. Okay, so now you've got all these things picked out and planned out. If you haven't already, I'd recommend throwing them into PC Part Picker to see if it flags anything as being incompatible. Also, this will give you an idea of what the prices of these things are, although I will say that they're going to suggest all sorts of websites that sell this stuff, and you might personally only be comfortable buying off of more reputable places where you're sure you can do good returns. Maybe you want to limit yourself to Amazon, Newegg, Best Buy, Micro Center, things like that. Whatever. I'm not saying limit yourself to those. I'm just saying think about where you're comfortable actually buying from. And then I'd also recommend posting that PC Part Picker list in some kind of PC building subreddit or online forum to get some critiques and feedback from other people. Now, on that note, that doesn't mean the critiques and feedback you're going to get are correct, okay? So take anything that you get online feedback there with a grain of salt. Now, it's possible you threw everything into PC Part Picker and you found out you're actually over your budget. Now, one option is just increase your budget if you can do that financially responsibly. But maybe you need to start cutting things from your budget. Now, if you're posting this online, you might get some feedback on where to cut. Now, here's my advice on what to think through when you're considering cutting for your budget. So all of these components can be cut down to lower priced ones, but each of those will have an impact on your gaming performance, but some less so than others. So this is a tier list of kind of what you can cut, and the farther you go down this list, the larger decrease you'll get to your gaming performance of your computer. And again, this might be oversimplified, but here's the basic idea. Your case doesn't really impact your gaming performance other than airflow and temperatures. Okay, your storage size doesn't really impact your gaming performance as long as you have enough storage to install the games. Although the storage speed can affect load times and things, but blah, blah. If you have a reasonably decent SSD, it's going to be fine. Again, look up reviews on that. Your motherboard, again, doesn't have a big impact on the actual speed the games run at as long as it's compatible with the parts that you need and you're not doing crazy overclocking. The CPU cooler, again, as long as it gets your CPU up and running, you're fine. You might not be able to overclock as much if you lower the CPU cooler, but you can do that. Now the GPU cooler, so the different versions of, like, let's say you're buying an RTX 3070. There's a whole bunch of them. The Founders Edition, theoretically, is priced at $499. But you can find other versions of it that might cost $600 or $700. And really all they have is, maybe a factory overclock and a better cooler. And that will make them run faster, but not all that much faster. It's a few percent. So if you're willing to drop to a lower end cooler, you might also think about things like the noise the fans make and all of that. But like, you can buy a less expensive version of the same graphics card that's still gonna give you very similar performance for a lot less money in some cases. All right. Now you can think about your RAM speeds. Like I said, you might want 3600 megahertz RAM, but maybe you could find a 3000 or 3200 megahertz set of RAM for less money. That will have an impact, but only up to a certain point. It's not going to be as impactful as just like buying a worse CPU, but hey, let's look at that next. So if you're gonna buy a worse CPU, you're gonna downgrade your CPU. You might want to look at downgrading cores first if you had already targeted something like an 8-core CPU or more. You don't actually need 8 or more cores for most games. Cutting down to 6 cores or even 4 cores, 4 is pretty low these days, but again, this all depends on your budget. But cutting the CPU cores, if your game, let's say, only uses 6 cores and you bought an 8-core CPU, those extra 2 cores aren't really doing anything for you in terms of the gaming performance. So cutting them doesn't really hurt you. It might hurt your future of games, that might perform more, or if you're trying to do things in the background, or video editing and things like that, fine. But in terms of straight up gaming performance, sometimes cutting cores isn't really gonna help your particular games have that big of an impact, although it can in certain games for sure. Now, the CPU speed will have a bigger impact, because let's say you drop from a 6-core like a Ryzen 5600X down to a Ryzen 3600X. Those have the same number of cores, but they run at a slower instructions per cycle, whatever. The point is that that's going to have a bigger impact on your gaming performance, and you will need to look up gaming reviews for those CPUs to understand the kind of gaming performance you're going to lose there. But keep in mind that you might be GPU bottlenecked anyway, so that might not actually have that big of an impact on your performance, depending on the GPU and monitor resolution you were playing at. Which now brings us to the GPU. This is going to have the biggest impact on your gaming, so cutting your GPU down to a slower GPU, actually a worse model of GPU, is going to be by far the biggest impact on your build. Okay, now, once you've revised this and cut it down for budget, you'll probably want to run that through PC Part Pickers, post on subreddits and forums and blah, 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 all again, and you might want to run through this process a few times. Once you're feeling like you've got a good build, you can buy it all and watch and read build guides and read and use your motherboard manual, all that sort of things. But the point is, what if you try to cut this all down and you're still over budget? Well, now you go back to the monitor, okay? Maybe you were trying to build a 4K gaming machine and it's just realistically not in your budget. Or maybe you were trying to build a 1440p gaming machine, it's just not in your budget, you might drop down to 1080p, that kind of a thing. So you can jump back to the beginning and run through all of this again, targeting a lower gaming spec, basically. And again, once you get all that, I recommend buying it all at once. Sometimes I've noticed people like try to buy parts as they get the money to do it, but by the time you do that, the parts you bought at the beginning might even be outdated or something like that compared to the parts that are available once you actually put it all together. I've seen a lot of people get trapped in that. Now, some people will recommend buying things, when there's a good deal on them, and that's fine if you're going to buy within a small window of time. But I've seen people try to put this together over too long of a period of time, and then things get outdated, and they end up regretting it and getting themselves in a bit of a hole. All right, and like I said, you'll want to watch and review and read build guides, but in the end, you should be using your manuals, like your motherboard manual and your case manual and all the manuals for your parts, as the primary resource when you're actually doing your build. Okay, guys, this video is getting pretty long. I'm going to end it here. How do you guys plan it? Let me know in the comment sections, or do you have any specific questions about all of this? And I hope you guys have an excellent day.